What I want to talk about today, the sort of starting point for the discussion is, of all times and in all places, 1938. When Hitler came to conquer Czechoslovakia, Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, shrugged it off as a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. Now, this is a notorious phrase, but I think not a careless phrase, that Chamberlain, who didn't get to be Prime Minister without being pretty good at reading public opinion, thought that somehow this particular phrase would, the fact that there were 643 miles between London and Prague, that the distance and obscurity of Czechs would make it morally and politically acceptable to sacrifice them to Nazi Germany. Now, this was the language of moral unconcern, a deliberate attempt to make the fate of the Czechs something that the British public didn't care about. Now, the premise of the human rights movement is that the suffering of Czechs or Kurds or Kosovars or Darfuris is on an equal level to the suffering of Brits or Americans. And the task, I think, of the human rights movement is to try and bridge those, the miles between London and Prague or London and Beijing to shrink the distance between distant peoples. And what we have today on this panel are a group of people who do that for a living. That we have people who try and make the suffering of people in foreign, distant, sometimes unfamiliar lands as real and immediate as the suffering of those of us in this room. And our panelists today are going to talk about the tremendous difficulty of finding out what's really happening, of bearing witness in these far-flung and often very, very dangerous parts of the world. Romeo Dallaire, the Canadian general who was in charge of the UN mission in Rwanda, once said that a reporter with a line to the west was worth a battalion on the ground. So this afternoon we have about a division up here. I'm going to introduce them, they'll talk, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So starting with Barbara Demick, who is the new Beijing bureau chief for the LA Times. Barbara has reported from Seoul, Baghdad, Jerusalem, Sarajevo, and Berlin in a 13-year career as a foreign correspondent. She's moving to Beijing later this year. She won the Overseas Press Club Award for Human Rights Reporting, the Polk Award, the Asia Society's Osborne Elliott Award, and the Robert F. Kennedy Award. She's the author of a wonderful book about Bosnia called Lugavina Street, Life and Death in a Sarajevo Neighborhood. She's currently writing a book about North Korea called Holding Hands in the Dark, to be published next year by Doubleday. We've also, at Princeton, been particularly fortunate to have Barbara with us this year as a Ferris professor teaching a course about reporting on repressive regimes. Peter Maass is a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine, the author of another wonderful book on Bosnia called Love Thy Neighbor, A Story of War, which won book prizes from the Overseas Press Club and from the LA Times. In recent years, Peter has reported for the Times Magazine from Iraq, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, among other places. He began his journalism career in Brussels with the Wall Street Journal, and subsequently was based in South Korea and Eastern Europe for the Washington Post, where he covered the war in Bosnia. He's working on a new book about the way that oil shapes global politics, to be published by Knopf in 2008. And finally, Ken Roth, who is the executive director of Human Rights Watch. As most of you know, Human Rights Watch is probably the best respected human rights group in the world, investigating and fighting human rights abuses in some 70 different countries. The group has quadrupled in size under Ken's leadership. Before coming to Human Rights Watch, Ken was a federal prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, and also a prosecutor in the Iran-Contra investigator in Washington. He's done human rights investigations around the globe, particularly interested in wartime military conduct, international justice, and the human rights policies of the United States and of the United Nations, as well as multinational businesses. He writes often for places like the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, and the New York Review of Books. So we're going to start with Barbara. Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
you can't hear me. I don't think I... That's the mic, the other's good lamp. Okay. I don't think I resound quite as Carrie does. Anyway, I'm going to talk about the situation in the story, which is borrowing a phrase from Vivian Gornick, because we as foreign correspondents find them...
Can't hear.
Try the mic. I need a producer here. Okay. We as foreign correspondents find ourselves, very much part of the humanitarian aid operation when we work on the ground. As a foreign correspondent in all of the places I've worked, I've always worked very closely with humanitarian aid workers. Generally, they're our best sources of information. They also tend to have better cars than we do, so they take us around and bring us places. We usually have bigger expense accounts, so we take them to lunch. And, in return, we have to tell their story. And, yes, they rely on us to pull the purse strings, so to speak. And I would say we suffer from a lot of the same problems, which is that donor fatigue and reader fatigue sort of kick in around the same time. Readers get sick of stories. Donors get sick of stories. I will start with Bosnia, which was my first foreign assignment. I remember my first day in Zagreb, this was 1993, walking into the UNHCR offices and seeing a cartoon on the front door that was from a Dutch newspaper, and it had a television salesman advertising a model that would change channels whenever the word Bosnia was mentioned. This didn't really bode well for my getting stories into the newspaper about Bosnia. It was already 2 years into the fighting, and people were just sick of it. This was around the same time that The Onion ran a very funny satirical story, which is Clinton deploys vowels to Bosnia. As you know, Serbo-Croatian doesn't have very many vowels. And so this was, where the story had ended up. And, it was just, amazing for me. I had, barely been out of New Jersey to be staying in the Holiday Inn in Sarajevo and watching people being shot by snipers in front of my hotel window. And, we developed techniques to get our readers to identify. And some of them, some of this will sound very cynical, but we had a rule at my paper at the time, was the Philadelphia Inquirer. You couldn't start a story with a foreign name. You couldn't say, Vesna Chernovich. You had to say, a Bosnian mother of four, or, you couldn't say, Che Sang-hun. You'd have to say, a North Korean coal miner. Everybody had to be identifiable by what they were at the beginning. And you also had to make the story clear. And this is what I will say very cynically about the war in Bosnia and what I saw as the course of the story in the time I was covering it. At the beginning of the war, you had sort of, bad Serbs versus good Muslims. And there was a lot of public interest. You had images of the concentration camps at Amarska coming out, and that, one image is worth a lot. You had, images of starving prisoners with their ribs showing. It evoked images of the concentration camps during the Holocaust. But then the story got muddied, and where it went off the map was when the Croats started fighting with the Muslims. Suddenly you had Muslims versus Serbs versus Croats. And it became a very murky, confusing story, and people lost interest. And then it got even worse because the Bosnian Muslims started getting arms, and they started doing bad things too. And I have found in general, as a foreign correspondent, if you do not have identifiable good guys versus bad guys, you have to have an arch villain and a very pure victim, your story falls off the map. And, I as an anxious mother, I read the newspaper to my 6-year-old son, and he always, cuts through this and says, "But, Mommy, who's the good guy and who's the bad guy?" I think older, more sophisticated readers are doing the same thing. And this is a real challenge for us as foreign correspondents, because sometimes the victims are not so pure, and sometimes the villains, have their side of the story also. I would say also that a foreign story, for it to have legs, this is what we say, legs means staying power as a story, has to make people feel good about themselves. If the reader is going to give money or pay attention or talk about it at a cocktail party, there has to be some element about that story that is going to make him or her feel good about themselves. And I'll talk now about another completely different aid situation, which was covering the tsunami. I was in Banda Aceh a few days after the tsunami hit. And the tsunami was a very interesting story because even for those of us who had been in the business a long time, we didn't anticipate how much public interest there would be. It literally swept us away, and there were several reasons for it, some of it quite arbitrary, and not really even proportional to the story, which was huge. I mean, it was huge. The death toll alone was over 100,000. But there was the novelty value. The tsunami, was different. It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't a concentration camp. It wasn't, flooding. We hadn't seen a tsunami like this. So there were great images. It also happened the day after Christmas. So a lot of the staff, foreign staff, was home for the holidays during Christmas. So, but those of us in Asia usually stay because Christmas is not such a big deal in Asia. So you had a lot of staff in Asia that could be deployed, and you wouldn't believe that at a big newspaper it can be that arbitrary, but it is. But there was something else about the tsunami, which was, at least on the Indonesia side, the victims were Muslim, and this was in the middle of the Iraq War, and the U.S. Marines were being deployed to help distribute aid. And, I was, at one point, I was kind of rescued by the Marines myself. It's a long story I won't get into, but I had ended up stuck in a little muddy town without any money, with my car broken down, and actually feeling a little sick when I saw a helicopter of Marines who sort of rescued me. And I ended up traveling with them for about a week. And the Marines were on the USS Bon Homme Richard, and they had been about to be deployed to the Persian Gulf when they were rerouted to Indonesia to distribute aid, and they were just, pleased as can be because, instead of going into this dangerous situation where they would feel bad about themselves, here they were the heroes, and they were so happy, and they were very happy to see a reporter for the LA Times, and we had a really good working relationship. They had Starbucks coffee on their boat, and it was fabulous. But we were driving around these towns, and they weren't wearing their flak jackets, and they were like leaning out, hi guys, hi, and the children were like thumbs up, America, America. They were thrilled, and the aid kept on coming because this was something Americans felt good about themselves, and I felt good to be American, and I felt good to be on their truck, and they were really happy to be there. The odd thing about the tsunami is it really did touch people, and there was a huge outpouring of aid, maybe too much, because what had happened with the tsunami largely was that there were not that many injured people, and there were not as many homeless people as you would think, because the waves hit early in the morning, and for the most part, if your house was destroyed, you were dead. You didn't need another house. And if you were inland, you were alive. And these medical units were working on the ground, and they had nothing to do. And people started coming in for miles to try to get, gallbladder operations and, all sorts of stuff. I mean, I was hanging out with Médecins Sans Frontières, and they were bored. I mean, this was, it was not that it wasn't a big disaster, but, people were dead. It was, similar to the collapse of the Twin Towers. You were alive or you were dead. There was not a lot of middle ground. But, as a result, the aid agencies at some point were kind of stumbling all over each other. But, I think that was the key element. People felt good about themselves. The third case I'll talk about, because it's what my current work involves North Korea. And North Korea is just the opposite. The North Koreans are the ultimate in annoying victims. They're not grateful. They're hostile to their donors. North Korea has, just briefly suffered from an acute famine since 1992. At least 2 million, maybe 3 million people have died. They continue to die. the North Koreans are very tough on the aid community. They are not grateful victims. They do admit aid workers. They don't admit aid workers who speak Korean because they might nose around and talk to people. They don't let aid workers out of their hotels, claiming that the aid workers might get hit by a car, which is absurd because there's no traffic in North Korea. And when aid workers come and want to look around, or also journalists, I've been to North Korea several times, you never see famine. When you're admitted into North Korea, you're taken on a highly escorted tour to the model city, Pyongyang, where you see these pink-cheeked children, and actually sometimes you see chubby people. Everything is very tidy. And what I found when I traveled in North Korea is if you tried to get off the beaten path or take a picture of somebody who looked like they needed aid, your minders would get very angry with you because the North Koreans don't have much, but they have pride. So, this is a place that is not going to get very much humanitarian aid. In covering North Korea, I've mostly worked at the Chinese-North Korean border, and the North Koreans that you see at the border, they swim across the rivers into China to get food, show palpable signs of malnutrition. They have, they're thin, they have a lot of fingernail diseases, some of them have, very young people have lost their hair. They're visibly suffering from famine. But, again, in North Korea, you don't see that. When I was in Pyongyang the last time, it was the same time that Hu Jintao was visiting, and China supplies North Korea with most of its energy. And in honor of Hu Jintao's visit, they decided to turn on every light in the city, which was, very bizarre. Pyongyang is usually dark at night. There may be, a handful of lights in the apartment buildings or hotels, but, there's very little electricity. And I was surprised because in my hotel, the Korea, where the foreigners stay, I came back for the evening to change for dinner, and all the lights in my room were on. And, there were signs saying, turn off your lights. But when Hu Jintao was in town, every light in the city had to be on. And, I don't think Hu Jintao was fooled. I think he knows North Korea has no electricity. But this is, again, a very frustrating place to give aid to. And I don't think they'll be getting much more. I don't know what more to say. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I would say, again, the elements that I see for, a place that's likely to get humanitarian aid or humanitarian intervention is, from the perspective of the journalist, is, again, a clear narrative, identifiable good guys versus bad guys, a single image that can carry the story, the emaciated prisoners at Amarska, a child being carried, one photograph, novelty value, something unusual. And, I hate to say it, timing and location. If it's a place that reporters can get to, we'll publicize it. Terrible things happen in places that are too dangerous, too inaccessible. We don't know about them, and a lot of it ends up very arbitrary. Anyway, thank you.
Well, like Barbara, I also covered the war in Bosnia, among other conflicts, and I covered it in 1992 and 93. I wasn't entirely through that time doing just Bosnia. I occasionally did some other stories in Eastern Europe. And the story throughout that period, and this is a period when I was in Sarajevo and all throughout Bosnia writing about atrocities and people being killed in front of me and all that, the story that actually got the most reader reaction by far was not actually a story about refugees at all. It was, in fact, about horses, and it was about horses in Hungary. I did a story while on a break about this stable of Lipizzaner stallions that Hungary had had throughout the communist era as kind of a prestige project. And this story wasn't even published on the front page of the Post. It was buried in it somewhere. But I happened to have a line in this story where I said if, money isn't found to keep this stable together, these horses could end up in tins of cat and dog food. This was a joke that some people didn't get, and so the Washington Post and myself, as a result, got a flood of offers for people to donate money to the horses, to somehow help the horses of Hungary, these Lippes honors. And I suppose, kind of the moral that I could take from that, or any reporter reporting on humanitarian catastrophes would take, is to write about horses rather than people, because that's what seems to get, in some cases, the readers' reaction. And this was a consistent problem for, I think, everybody. Barbara had this, myself, trying to get people interested in these very horrible things that were going on in Bosnia, that sometimes just seemed too far away, too foreign for people to grab a hold of. And so indeed, particularly in Bosnia, the way that I, as a journalist, and I think most journalists tried to deal with this, is to personalize it. Instead of writing about the whole picture and what's happening throughout the country, or even what's happening in one city, is to focus on one person. So, for example, there was a lot of wartime rape in Bosnia, primarily by Serb and, to a lesser extent, Croatian soldiers, of Muslim women. And instead of writing a story about kind of, the statistics and all that, I went to Zenica, which is a town in central Bosnia, and found a woman, a young girl, about 18 years old, 17 years old, who had been raped and who was willing to talk to me about it. And so I wrote a story about what happened to her. And it was a very long story, and it ran on the front page of the Washington Post, and it got a fair amount of attention. I should say, though, that there was a slight disappointment that I had with the way that story was used by the paper, because I filed it, I think it was on December 23rd. and my editors held on to it. And then on December 24th, I said, what are you going to do with it? And they said, well, we want to run it big splash on page 1, but we're not going to run it on Christmas Day because we don't want to disturb our readers with this kind of story on Christmas Day. And I said, but this is precisely what we should be doing. And they said, no, we can't. So it ran the next day. It still got a lot of attention, but it did kind of convey to me that there are certain times and certain ways that you can present things to readers, and there's a limit beyond which newspapers don't want to go. Photography is one, of course, wherein, particularly in terms of civilian casualties, but also obviously in terms of military casualties, those pictures tend not to be shown terribly prominently in newspapers because they upset readers. My view, and the view of lots of other journalists, is I think they should be published there. They should upset readers because war is upsetting. This is the way to make people understand it. But, there are standards and ethics or whatever kind of word you want to use to define them, and this is what happens. Another example in terms of trying to personalize things that I used from Bosnia was, again, I was in the Holiday Inn along with Barbara and everybody else, and just standing at my window one day, I saw a guy get shot by a sniper in front of me. And this had happened all the time. We would write about it, We would write about it quite a bit. In a general way, perhaps, and just kind of talk about the danger individuals, including journalists, actually faced of being hit by a sniper. In this case, though, I just wrote pretty much a first-person story without actually using the word I about standing at the window, and watching this guy get shot. And what happened? He got shot, heard him yell. I heard the shot, I heard him yell, saw him, watched people yell at him because he was in the open. He tried to kind of drag himself to safety. He couldn't. He was injured too badly. Somebody finally ran out and dragged him to safety. And it all happened within a space of 2 or 3 minutes. And I wrote about just that 2 or 3 minutes. And again, that was a story that got a fair amount of attention. There is a downside, though, in terms of trying to get readers' attention, compassion, whatever you want to call it, money, letters to congressmen, whatever. The problem is that even when you succeed in getting the compassion, the reaction that you want to get, it often doesn't get translated into the action that's necessary. So, for example, in Bosnia, the work that Barbara did, that I did, that a lot of other journalists did, finally it actually did get people to pay attention. People did begin to care about what was going on, because there were these people in the center of Europe, on the edge of Europe, we can say, who were getting killed. It was genocide. And the problem was that the reaction tended to be humanitarian, which is, okay, let's get the United Nations in there, let's get them food, let's get them shelter, nice blue tarps, so that when they get bombed out of their homes, they don't have to kind of get snowed on or rained on. And this kind of was palatable for the people there, but also palatable, I think, for readers in America and for politicians. Okay, this is the way we can take care of it. We can be seen to react. We can react. It wasn't the solution at all. In fact, In some ways, it worsened the situation because it allowed the genocide to continue. The right kind of reaction in a case like this was military intervention of one sort or the other, either by giving arms to the Bosnians or by bombing the Serbs, which eventually happened. But by turning it into a humanitarian issue rather than a political issue, the situation wasn't resolved. All that happened was that indeed there was kind of short-term care provided and it did help people, but the genocide continued. There was, when I was in Sarajevo one time, a girl, I forget her name, like 12 years old, got injured very seriously. And for some reason, the BBC did a little story, went to the hospital and visited her, and it was on the BBC. Poor little girl, 11 years old, she's going to die in a week unless she has a brain operation that the hospital in Sarajevo can't possibly give her. She needs to be evacuated. And for some reason, this caught on in the UK particularly. And John Major, who was the British Prime Minister, was asked about it during the Prime Minister's question hour, and it became a major issue. And in the end, actually, kind of all these kinds of barriers were removed, and this little girl was evacuated excuse me, by British soldiers from the Kosovo hospital in Sarajevo, taken out to London, and given the surgery that she needed. I forget actually whether she survived or not. And everybody congratulated themselves. The British government congratulated itself. The voters congratulated the British government. Pressure was relieved off of the British government for other action because they had done this action. And again, it wasn't the action excuse me, that was really needed. Because it gave the impression that, oh, well, all we need to do is just remove these people from danger. Let's get all the kids out of Bosnia. And there were a lot of kids, actually, who were evacuated from Bosnia. But this wasn't the answer that was needed in the least bit to the problem, because it would just empty out the country and allow the war to continue, allow the Serbs to win the war. So this was an issue that even once you reached the compassion and got people to react, you still had this other barrier, a very large barrier of getting the right kind of political action. And it was something that I think all of us struggled with quite a bit. And in the end, even though the U.S. did intervene and there was a bombing campaign against the Serbs, it wasn't actually done, I don't think, as a result of kind of humanitarian concerns that the Clinton administration had. It was done because NATO was beginning to kind of come apart, and there were real divisions in the West that were damaging to long-term political interests that had nothing to do with Bosnia. So Bosnia was taken off the table through that particular bombing campaign. One other way that kind of, well, I as a journalist certainly tried to make a difference in terms of making people understand and care about the humanitarian and political disaster. Excuse me, my hay fever is really bad, so I'm having a little trouble here. It's that time of year. Was after 1993, I kind of stopped covering the war and decided to write a book about the war. And I wrote a book proposal, and it was a proposal for a very straightforward book about who, what, where, when, why, kind of explaining the whole war in a coherent context. Excuse me. And so I found an agent for this proposal who circulated it in New York, and the reaction came back from every publisher it was circulated to. Mr. Maass seems to be a good writer, but Bosnia just isn't going to sell. And so the agent said to me, you know, is there any other subject you'd like to write on? And I said no. And then I talked with a colleague of mine, and I explained to him I really want to write this book. I really feel a need to try to make sense out of Bosnia, not really for myself, but for people who just still didn't understand it and told me they didn't understand it. And his advice to me, he said, look, you need to have one person at the center of your book, and it's better if that person is an American. And pretty much as a result of that advice, which seemed to me to make sense, because I had no other option, really, I wrote a book that was basically a memoir, my experience covering the war in Bosnia. And I wrote half of that book and then found another agent, found a publisher, and the book did pretty well. And it wasn't because it was about a war that people wanted to learn more about. It was because it was about my experience of this war. So readers identified with me were interested in my experience. And through my experience, they did learn about the war and hopefully understood it and maybe cared a bit more. But it needed that kind of channel. And I was the channel. And I didn't think that there was going to be any other way to do it. One of the consequences of journalism of that sort, which does work, I think, is that it can go too far. So, you know, today, particularly in TV, You have, I guess the syndrome of correspondents like Anderson Cooper on CNN, and it's kind of like, what are they called, emo anchors or something like that, where basically the story is all about the reporter. And it's half the time if, the reporter, and this is TV I'm talking about, is in Africa covering some war, some conflict, the camera's on the reporter half of the time. And you're seeing more of the reporter than Africa. You're hearing more about the reporter's reactions than you are about Africa. And I guess it's just a Faustian bargain that one has to make, because you actually probably do need Anderson Cooper or somebody like that going there and bringing kind of this Klieg light of attention on himself in order to make a bridge so that readers care a little bit or learn a little bit through that sort of American channel. And it's a Faustian bargain that one makes. The last thing that I would like to say about these things is I also reported from North Korea. I was based in South Korea for a while, and I went to North Korea on one occasion in 1989. And when you go into a totalitarian country such as that, and it is probably the greatest totalitarian country left, greatest I mean in the sense of the most total totalitarian country, you're controlled from the moment you arrive. You have a minder at your side. You're in a hotel. I was in a different one called the Potonggang, which is a little bit out of the center of Pyongyang, but still in the city. You can't go anywhere without your minder. And so you have to kind of negotiate with your minder about what you do. Like you want to do something, your minder says, no, you can't do that. We have to go to Kim Il-sung's birthplace this morning. Okay, fine, I'll go to Kim Il-sung's birthplace, but I want to go into an apartment complex and walk around and talk to people, and you negotiate that. And finally, maybe you get some kind of agreement where you get to do a little bit of what you want to do. So there was exactly this kind of negotiation that I had. I wanted to go into an apartment complex and talk with ordinary North Koreans. Now, of course, in North Korea, in Pyongyang, there are no ordinary North Koreans. It's a model city, and only party members and people who are loyal live there, and they will not tell you anything that's at odds with the official line. But nonetheless, I wanted to try to get something that was a little bit spontaneous. So I go with the minder to one of the larger apartment complexes, and we drive up, get out of the car, and then he says, points to a building 50 yards away, says, oh, there's a woman in front of it. Why don't we go talk to that woman? And I said, no, I don't think so. Let's go to that building there and go in there and find somebody, knock on some doors. And the minder says, no, I think we should talk to that woman there. And I'm like, no. That building, let's go in that building over there. And he basically takes me by the sleeve, says, no, we must go talk to that woman. And, I knew two things. I knew, first off, I wasn't going to be able to go anywhere else but to talk to that woman. I knew that if I somehow dragged him to the building that I wanted to go into, he would no longer be living in Pyongyang. And that would be the end of his career, if not his life. So I went, talked to the woman, and went through the whole show. They took me upstairs to their nice apartment, and my God, there was all this food and a dinner that was being cooked, and, it's extremely difficult. In situations like that, and this is actually what subsequently happened. We flash forward 15 years practically. I'm now based in New York, and I want to do a story about North Korea for the Times Magazine. A profile of Kim Jong-il. My editor said, great. They said, why don't you do that? I said, great, I really wanted to. And of course, I called up the North Korean office at the United Nations, which is the only North Korean office in the United States. And they just didn't return my phone calls. They weren't going to let me go to North Korea. I knew that. Instead, what I did is I talked to exiles. I talked to Russians and others who had been in North Korea. I went to Seoul, talked to people who had been in North Korea, who had met Kim Jong-il, and assembled a lot of information about Kim Jong-il as a result of that. And was able actually to write a fairly, I think, good profile of the man. And it's that kind of work, kind of working around the edges, that often gets at the story and makes people be able to understand the story. Because, when Barbara mentioned talking to North Korean refugees on the Chinese border, if you want to do a story about what's going on in North Korea, in a way you don't go into North Korea, although that'd be great to do and you get some interesting material, but you won't get the truth. You won't be able to see anything at all, except for a couple of model set-up situations. You go to the border, you talk with the refugees, people who are no longer in the country, and who can talk freely. And you, of course, then have problems of, well, can you trust them? refugees, exiles exaggerate. It's very hard to kind of assemble a totally accurate picture, but usually you can get more information and assemble a good picture that way than by going into some situation where you're totally controlled all the time. Anyways, there will be a lot of questions and much more, so I'll just kind of hold the rest and turn it over to Kenneth. Thank you.
I'm going to come at this question in a related but slightly different way, because both Barbara and Peter are obviously journalists, and so while both of them are very compassionate, very engaged journalists, their job isn't necessarily to try to change policy or to end abuses. Their job is to tell the story, and in a sense inform the world to then act as they would want. I don't have to go in with that level of neutrality. It's at some levels what Human Rights Watch does is the same as journalism, in that we have researchers who are in all these same places whose job it is to, as accurately and objectively as they can, report what's happening. And in that sense, the challenges about how do you get people interested, how do you keep them engaged, are very similar to the challenge that a good journalist would face. But then we have to go the next step, and we have sort of a whole other half of our staff that is not in the field, but whose job it is to take this information and get something done with it so that we can curb the abuses. And in part, that's the same people. I mean, you may be a researcher one day, and the next day in the Capitol talking to the various ministers, trying to push them to change the abuses that you just recorded. Sometimes they're different people, because we also have people stationed in Washington or Brussels or London or Berlin or various power centers around the world, trying to take this information that our researchers are collecting and deploy it in a way that will push these influential governments to then act on it. Now, the premise of, I guess, this two-day conference has been that the way this policy pressure takes place is through public engagement and public mobilization. And so the question is really, how do you keep the public engaged? How do you avoid compassion fatigue? How do you keep people from getting tired of the same old story? And those are, all questions that we grapple with. Although, one point I wanted to make at the outset is that it actually doesn't sum up most of what the human rights movement does. I think that there is a sort of, a caricature out there that says that, what we're really about is naming and shaming, and so if people get tired of the story, you're no longer effectively shaming because they've stopped reading about it, and that when you're successful, you've mobilized the public. And so you've got a lot of Amnesty International members writing letters, or you have a lot of people out demonstrating. And in extreme cases, that is what happens. But that's not what happens 90% of the time. And so I thought I would maybe describe about how it is that we get things done without mobilizing the public. Because the truth is that in order to mobilize people, to really get them sending their emails, writing their letters, going to demonstrations, holding the candle, it takes a certain kind of problem. It takes a problem that is, first of all, relatively static. Because if you're going to mobilize effectively, you have to be able to kind of build up momentum over a period of time. And so, it could be, a war. I mean, Bosnia is an example of something that really, looked pretty similar for years. And so you could at least theoretically mobilize around that. Or it also has to be something that, in a sense that people can understand, that they can get their hands around. And so, there are some issues that do lend themselves to that kind of mobilization, but most of what we do doesn't. Just to give you an example, Human Rights Watch was very involved with the effort to surrender Charles Taylor to be tried. Charles Taylor was a former president of Liberia who had been responsible for mass slaughter, not only in Liberia, but also next door in Sierra Leone, and he had been indicted by a UN-created court there. But when his regime was about to crumble in Liberia, he fled to Nigeria, nearby, and was given refuge by Nigerian President Obasanjo, a guy who's actually going to be stepping down imminently, we hope, in Nigeria. And so we spent about 2 years trying to convince Obasanjo to surrender Taylor to custody and have him tried. Now, at a certain level, this would be the kind of thing that you could mobilize people around, because it was 2 years, and that's long enough to get people interested in this. but it frankly was too obscure. Most people had no idea where Sierra Leone or Liberia was. They didn't know who Charles Taylor was. It got complicated, like what does Nigeria have to do with all this? It just, it didn't really lend itself to popular mobilization. We tried. We tried mobilizing, in Nigeria. I actually went to Nigeria and spent about a week, doing every single TV show and talking to every single newspaper and making a big stink about this. I met with Obasanjo numerous times. At one point I remember I was at a Council on Foreign Relations meeting that he was doing. He did it every year. And I raised my hand to ask the Charles Taylor question. And he looked at me and said, "Didn't you ask that last year?" And so at a certain level, the guy felt completely harassed. But it wasn't making any difference. And in the end, all these efforts to reach out to the public is not what in the end got Charles Taylor surrendered. What got Charles Taylor surrendered was that Obasanjo wanted to visit with President Bush to get Bush's blessing for a third term. Nigeria, like the United States, has a 2-term limit in its constitution. And Obasanjo wanted to change the constitution so he could run again and needed Bush's blessing for that. But to do that, he needed a meeting at the White House. And so, with no popular mobilization, with no press, with none of this stuff, we just went to the White House and said, you can't meet with this guy until he turns over Charles Taylor. And they agreed. And it was that, more than anything else, that got Charles Taylor surrendered, after all these efforts. And so, I cite that just as an example that, popular mobilization had nothing to do with this. But nonetheless, a very important precedent was set, which is that this mass murderer is now facing his day in court. And this is something that other African leaders will certainly think about as they consider whether they should embark on a similar path of mass murder. Another example, one that I've been involved in just recently, in Uzbekistan. Again, one of these countries where is that? So it's extremely hard to get anybody to write about Uzbekistan. It's hard to get a visa in. It's one of those stands, someplace in Central Asia, but nobody can really figure out, what's the difference between Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. Who knows, right? Uzbekistan happens to be sort of the most important of the stands in economic and political terms. It also has an absolutely ruthless leader, Islam Karimov, who 2 years ago, next month, decided to respond to a demonstration in his capital by mowing down hundreds of people, surrounded them with troops, took out the machine guns, and killed them. And so, how do you respond to something like this? Now, at the time, there was a lot of press interest. In fact, I remember going to Moscow and I did a press conference there, and it was packed. We just released our report on this. We snuck somebody into Uzbekistan at considerable risk. She had pretended basically to be going to a wedding and sort of went in with a baby and a grandpa, and sort of walked her way through 5 checkpoints and got in and spent 2 days collecting information. So, at a certain level, we were like journalists. Maybe a little different from journalists, but we got the story out. And there was a lot of interest in that. So there's a certain degree of shaming. But then, how do you respond to this? How do you put pressure on Karimov to make it clear that this is unacceptable, that he needs to allow an international investigation, that he has to reverse the crackdown on civil society, the arrest of human rights defenders that he's currently engaged in? The key to this is, frankly, the European Union, because the European Union has the aid and trade relationship that Uzbekistan cares about. But the key player in the European Union has been Germany. They have the current presidency. They're also the most important kind of interlocutor with Uzbekistan at this stage. And Germany wants to have friendly engagement with Uzbekistan. It wants, it wants an energy relationship with Russia and the former Soviet bloc. It doesn't believe the pressure is the way to go. It wants dialogue. And, Karimov will have dialogue with you until you're blue in the face. It won't make any difference. But this is the German strategy. And so, how do we change this? Now, at a certain level, we have been, putting articles in the press, and the German press has been very good about running this. But the government has been somewhat impervious to this. And so, just this last week, when they started the trial of our interpreter, and used that same moment to revoke the accreditation of our researcher in our Tashkent office, we took these little facts, called basically the national security advisor to Merkel, and said, Merkel's got to get on the phone with the foreign ministry. This is utterly unacceptable. You got to change your policy. We don't know what the result. He got back to us and said, yes, she's moved on this. She's talking to the foreign ministry. They're impossible, but we're seeing what we can do. And we're sort of in the middle of this conversation right now. But what's interesting, again, is that this had nothing to do with popular mobilization. This is just sort of having the contacts, having the information, and knowing how to deploy that information in a way that makes sense. Now, I don't want to pretend, though, that, that mobilization is irrelevant. It certainly isn't. And we do need to involve the public. But one thing that you learn very quickly is that most of the time there is sort of this unwritten understanding between sort of activists like myself and politicians, and that is that because there is no poll every day, saying what do you think about Uzbekistan or what do you think about Charles Taylor, there is this sort of unwritten rule, this understanding that we're going to treat press coverage as a surrogate for the public. And so what matters, in fact, much more than mobilizing people is whether you've got the LA Times and the New York Times writing about it. And there is a tendency, I think it's just sort of human nature, to assume that, if people are reading about this, some number are going to care about it. And therefore, you don't want to act in a way that is different from what people are reading about. And so this is, in a sense, surrogate mobilization. It's not real mobilization. Now, I don't want to pretend that you never need real mobilization. You probably all have read in Samantha Power's book when Anthony Lake, in the middle of the Rwandan genocide, said, why should we do anything? Nobody's writing to us. Go make some noise out there. Now, that was a completely cheap excuse. It had nothing to do with anything. The Clinton administration was not going to, get involved, regardless of how many people wrote letters, because this was, 16 months after Somalia, and there was no way that they were going to step in and rescue the people of Rwanda, regardless. But sometimes it helps to have popular mobilization. But a lot of the time, all that you really need is press coverage. And there's an assumption that that is, sort of the surrogate or the equivalent of popular mobilization. And so that is, really a lot of how we spend our time. But it's not enough just to have the press covering an issue. Because if all you hear about is things are terrible, and there's no sense of responsibility that the politician or policymaker has, you're not going to move him. Because the policymaker can say, yeah, I agree, things are terrible. Or, isn't this just too bad? And not do anything about it. And so what's required is not simply a description of what's going on. And I don't want to belittle it. I mean, that can be a very difficult process. I remember in the early days in Darfur where, again, no one knew where Darfur was. And we were calling journalists and begging for them to go in. And finally sent our own TV crew in so that we could come back with visuals and handed it to ABC, and then they ran it. But they wouldn't send their own person in. We begged and pleaded to get CNN in, and finally, after that ran, they sent their own team in. So, there's a certain kind of early on when you're trying to put something on the map, just, saying that it's there helps. But very quickly, people said, well, yeah, this is too bad, Darfur, yes, that's terrible. But, what do you do about it? And that's, in many ways, the most challenging part, because you have to somehow find a way to bring distant problems home and to make clear that there actually is something that a policymaker whom you can affect through your letter writing or your phone calls, that person can make a difference in this distant place. And to do that effectively is really a matter of telling the story. I think back, for example, we've talked about Bosnia. The biggest problem with Bosnia was the age-old hatred explanation. Sure, the Serbs and the Croats and the Muslims are killing each other, but they've always done that. Communism just kept the lid on. Lids come off, they're killing each other again. What else is new? What do you want us to do about this? And that was, the typical reaction. Similarly, with Rwanda. First of all, I remember during the early days of the genocide, people would be saying, what is it, the Hutsi and the Tutu and and who are these people again? And literally, this is some of the newspapers here had no idea, and so there were certain just basic explanations that had to be done. Fortunately, we had on our staff one of the world experts on Rwanda, a historian who'd been working there for 25 years already. So we kind of knew some of this and were able to explain it. But you have to kind of cut through the age-old hatreds argument in that sense and explain analytically that, well, actually there is a political reason why this is happening. Milosevic is trying to sort of, maintain power by transforming himself from a communist to a nationalist, or the Hutu power movement is trying to prevent, a compromise with the Rwanda Patriotic Front rebel movement because they feel that this is going to be, the end of their Hutu dominance, and so therefore they've launched this genocide, and there's a logic to it. And once you explain the rationale, then you can sort of talk about, okay, well, what are the incentives for the mover here, and how can you affect those incentives? And that's when you begin to sort of be able to outline what your government can do about it. Let me give you an example just recently of a kind of a press campaign that worked and one that didn't work. And I'll use Darfur as an example here. You probably all saw in the New York Times that, like, for day after day after day, for it seemed like a month or two, there were these, incredibly moving full-page ads about Darfur. I think mostly sponsored by the Save Darfur Coalition. And the problem with those ads, which cost millions of dollars and which did hardly anything, is that they didn't explain how you could make a difference. They said, things are terrible in Darfur, we got to stop this, in essence, was the answer. But they never explained how. And so, it allowed President Bush to say, yes, these are terrible, we really got to stop this. But there was never any sort of, Bush do this, or Congress do that. And if you do that, this is why it would make a difference. I will contrast that with one op-ed put in the Wall Street Journal about 2 weeks ago, which made an enormous difference. This was an op-ed by Mia Farrow and her son. And she pushed the idea of the Genocide Olympics. Now, what she meant by this is that in Beijing, in I guess 2 years, there will be Olympics. And these are enormously important to the Chinese government. China is by far and away the most important interlocutor with Sudan. It is the largest purchaser of its oil. It protects it on the Security Council through its veto. In essence, if there's anybody around the world who has the capacity to force Khartoum to stop the killing in Darfur, it's Beijing. And they're not doing it because they have this philosophy of not interfering in internal affairs and treating, every government without any strings attached and all, all the stuff you probably know. So they have done nothing to stop the killing in Darfur, and indeed have been providing gazillions of dollars through oil purchases to make it possible to arm the Janjaweed, the rebel movement in Darfur that is doing the bulk of the killing. So, it is fair to say that China is behind the killing, that it, in essence, is, it's quenching its thirst for oil with the blood of the people of Darfur. And so, why should China be able to have its long-sought Olympics free from the taint of the killing that it's indirectly sponsoring in Darfur? And thus, the very simple concept of the Genocide Olympics. And she actually made an appeal to Steven Spielberg, who is orchestrating the beginnings of he's going to be kind of the director of the pageant at the beginning of the Olympics, and said, why are people like this involved in the Genocide Olympics? Isn't this just like the person who kind of helped dress up the Berlin Olympics in 1936? And that little op-ed was like a roar in Beijing. And within days, there was an envoy not only in Sudan, a Chinese envoy who toured Darfur, came back to Khartoum and said, you've got to let in the UN peacekeepers, which everybody agrees is sort of the key to stopping the killing. And, Bashir, the Sudanese president, has now, maybe agreed to let in the next tranche of 3,000 peacekeepers, which is not, anywhere near the 20,000 that we're trying to get in there, but is a step in the right direction. And this didn't cost anything. This was not the millions of dollars of ads, but this was sort of a smart intervention because it not only said that everything's wrong, things are terrible in Darfur, which frankly we all know, but it explained how you can change it and how you, the reader, can make a difference by complaining to Coca-Cola, whoever it is who's going to be one of the sponsors of the Olympics, and putting pressure, through institutions close to home, through Steven Spielberg, to put pressure on Beijing to stop the killing there through the influence it has. So these are, this is just one example, but it shows that it's not enough just to expose, it's not enough to name and shame. you have to find a way to tie the terrible stuff going on to something you can do about in a realistic way. I mean, these are not made-up connections. This is what it's about. And that kind of connection is not something that we expect journalists to do. Because, in fact, one of the problems, I think, is that journalists tend to be either in Washington, or in North Korea. They sort of are. You don't get the same people, for the most part, writing about the policy issues and the events on the ground. It tends not to be the way newspapers are structured, and so that you can overcome that. But it's bringing these different parts together that is what Human Rights Watch tries to do. And I could tell other stories where we're involved, but I've been going on too long. But that is, in my view, the essence of effective mobilization. It is, telling a story that will move people, but then making clear that that story is not just, a fact in the world. It's not just the way life is, but it's the results of deliberate policy decisions by local actors. These actors care about certain things, whether it's getting a meeting with the White House or getting their next tranche of arms shipment or maintaining the oil revenue coming in or what have you, and that you can affect that thing that they care about by enlisting some government closer to home, Washington, Europe, what have you, where you can reach them as an individual. As the person who's reading this newspaper or reading this website, you can reach that person who has the capacity to pull the lever that the bad actor in some distant place really cares about. And that's how you move things. So anyway, I've gone on too long, but I'll stop there.
Great. We're going to open it up for questions now, but I'm going to abuse moderator's privilege by calling on Senator Ferris. Given that we've been talking about the extent to which all these people up here can put pressure on government, I thought you might want to speak.
I'm not a senator anymore. I'm not that politician.
Then alumni Ferris.
Yeah, that's right. No, thank you. And this is a fascinating, and it's a great way, I think, to integrate 2 days because it really does get down to the most common question that I receive, whether it's being on the ground in Africa or in as Barbara talked about it, I was in Sri Lanka 6 days after the tsunami hit. Just amazing. I went there as a physician, actually, and it's exactly what you said. There's nothing to do because of the nature of that catastrophe. But the question is, and the question even at lunch today and the last break, how do you tie all of this to an action? And the mobilization, the engagement, the energy that is required. And ultimately, that's what politics is all about. I mean, you go, for the most part, to have action and solutions to problems that what all of you are in the business of doing, and that is opening people's eyes to problems that they might not otherwise see. A couple of quick things. Peter, your comments on the humanitarian efforts. I was in Darfur again about 4 weeks ago now, and the humanitarian effort there is fascinating. The 13,000 humanitarian workers there in the last 2 months, 3 months, as you all know, and I think was talked about yesterday, there's been a real assault on the humanitarian workers themselves. But I've been there before and there now, and over that period of time, the focus is very much on the humanitarian workers, and there's a degree of stability. All of the emergency measures of starvation, of nutrition, all the critical criteria have all gotten so much better because of the really 65,000 people in one refugee camp, 20,000 in another, but all of the million or so people in these refugee camps has gotten so much better that it tends to take the urgency off in terms of the genocide. People don't really see; they hear the stories, and we heard some earlier today. The question that I would comment on, and then Ken, I think again that call to action. What makes it click? What is that magic in there that has the policymaker and the negotiator actually help resolve issues? I think is right on target. The engagement has to be there. The teachable moments have to be there. The receptive audience has to be there. The push from the American people, I think, does have to be there. But indeed, that last sort of leverage point that makes it click, that snap of the fingers, is often something that nobody ever sees. And that happens just all the time. But it has to be thought of as you go through. I guess the question I would ask, is there a saturation level when you're writing about this on the ground or from an activist movement where you're seeing the tragedies that are all over the world constantly and you're sent around to see? Do your editors and others recognize there's a saturation level? Right now, I think of issues like Darfur right now. It's hot. It's hot on college campuses. It's all the way around. It should be. And we've done a good job, lots of different things, I think, to get the issue out there. We all know that there are similar issues, probably not quite like Rwanda was, but similar to Darfur around the world. From your standpoint, is there a saturation level where you simply can't reach the people down in Nashville, Tennessee, or Memphis, or Jackson, Tennessee, with too much education? And that's just a question. That's a question I've always had, because as a politician, you end up focusing on an area, and after 3 months, you focus on another area. But I throw that question out to anybody. Or Gary, you pass it.
Well, I mean, I'll just this does work. I don't know if there's a saturation point, although there probably is, but certainly as a journalist on the ground reporting on humanitarian or political catastrophes, you do have to keep kind of pushing the limit. I remember, for example, in the summer of 1992, it was Roy Gutman of Newsday who came out with the first stories about the death camps that the Serbs were running in Bosnia, imprisoning mostly Muslims. And so then there was a big focus by everybody to write about that, what was going on in these camps, that they existed and who was there and how many people were getting killed and all that. And we did that. And then, like, after a few weeks, it was like, okay, what do you got now? And I remember interviewing a refugee. I must have been in central Bosnia, and he was talking about how, well, they had us fight each other. It was like kind of gladiators in the camps where, they'd get tired, the guards, of beating us up, so they'd say, okay, you two guys, you two prisoners, you fight each other. And so, I wrote all this down, and I asked other questions, and I kind of realized what I was doing then. I was just like, I knew I had to step it up, that I couldn't just write another story about the atrocities that were going on in the camps, that the twist of this next story I was going to do was going to be that, it was like a gladiator situation. And I found it kind of pathetic that I had to do that. That just writing another story about, the straight-on atrocities that these guards were committing wasn't going to, if it got into the paper, it wouldn't get in at the level of visibility that the previous one had gotten in, and I certainly couldn't keep doing that because I needed something else. I needed to turn it up. And you just have to deal with that, I suppose. It's the phrase is kind of compassion fatigue that we all kind of work with. But at a certain point, my wife was reminding me of this here. It's like kind of post-compassion. There is a limit.
I would just add I think the problem that Peter and Barbara faces journalists convincing their editors that this is something new worth writing about is compounded for us because we also have to convince the journalist to write about it. And this is, I guess, the difficulty that all of us work through something called news. And news implies it is new. And so if you have, something that is basically the same, it may be terrible, but if it's the same, it's not news. And so I think the struggle for all of us is to find new ways of talking about something that is still largely the same. And so what Peter's describing is you find a kind of a new twist to it. And we're constantly doing this. And you can't put out, your third or fourth report describing the killing in Darfur. It's just not going to work. So you focus on, well, it's spilling over the border into Chad, or, now it's going to the Central African Republic. Or, there's this, you find some new angle to it. Sometimes, frankly, the angle can be the policy debate. So, what's going on in the Security Council and is China and Russia standing in the way can be a new story that then lets you talk about Darfur again. Because that's ultimately what it's about. And even though it's all the same in Darfur, something new happened related to the story, which is your entree. And this is a huge challenge for all of us, is thinking about new ways of talking about the same thing, which I'm not so sure if it's so much compassion fatigue as it's just this is the business. It's the news business, and so you got to be new.
I don't have much to add to that. I would just say, as Ken said, it is a business, and it's a business that's under an extraordinary amount of pressure right now. And if people want to read about Anna Nicole Smith, at some point, how much more Darfur are you going to be giving them? I mean, that's as bad as it comes out. I mean, there's also there's this revolving spotlight when you're a foreign correspondent, and a story gets hot, like the tsunami, and it is so hot, and all the resources go to the tsunami, and you have these teams deployed, and then suddenly people are sick of it, and they, the spotlight has turned, and they move on, and it's always amazing to me whenever it happens. But the story's finished. As far as the novelty value is concerned, it's obviously not finished for the people who are on the ground who are suffering.
Great. Let's open it up.
A question for any or all of the panelists. As reporters and as war correspondents and human rights advocates, obviously you're working in very delicate political and social situations. Have any of you faced circumstances where you've been concerned that revealing certain information or things that you've borne witness to or that your contacts have borne witness to will in any way endanger those contacts or in any way worsen the political situation, either in the short term or in the long term? And how do you deal with these situations, both to protect your sources and their dignity, and to consider the potential political implications of what you're doing? Even when you're just a reporter and you're bearing witness, that can often turn into a political situation as well.
I mean, I'll start on that. Happens all the time. My recent work is with North Korean defectors, and when I do interviews with them, if they're identified, these are people who are out of North Korea, their relatives will be killed. They will be taken away and killed. And I have a huge burden to disguise the people who I'm interviewing, and it weighs very heavily. And that's an extreme example, but it's certainly. And I think pretty much all responsible journalists put the lives of their sources ahead of the story.
I just say there's something that's existed for a long time, but it's actually become accentuated somewhat recently, are the people whom we work with, the interpreters, the fixers, as we call them. I remember in Sarajevo, I had two interpreters that I worked with, and one of them was a woman who had a child, actually two children. One of whom was outside of the country, one of whom was in Sarajevo, and I just, I just had on my mind all the time, I really don't want anything to happen to her, and that's a situation which has become much more acute, particularly now in Iraq, but not just in Iraq, also in lots of countries throughout, particularly the Muslim world. The interpreters, the drivers who work for us are putting themselves at enormous peril because we are viewed in many places as, the enemy or the infidels or whatever. And so anybody who works for us is one of us, not one of them. And we have our passports, and we don't live in these countries. We come back home or whatever. We're protected. We live behind barbed wire and machine gun nests in places like Baghdad. Our interpreters don't, in Baghdad particularly. The outflow of interpreters because of the problems they face as a result of working for us is just tremendous. In Pakistan, that's also happened. I've had to help former interpreters of mine get out of these countries. And that has become not just a problem for us in terms of taking care of people whom we depend on, but it also has made it much more difficult in some cases to do the work that we need to do. And I think for the human rights organizations too, you have to be incredibly brave or incredibly foolish in some places to work for organizations like ours.
Yeah, and Peter's absolutely right that it's the local staff who's very much in jeopardy. And I just recently we've had to take one of our people out of Afghanistan. It's just the threats were getting too intense, and we had to move the person to Pakistan. And hopefully at some stage you can go back. But that's a real problem. The idea of protecting sources at this stage is totally routine, and we will, not name names or very openly use pseudonyms, and that I think is pretty accepted. The real dilemma is when there is a situation that you know if you exposed it, you could improve it, but there's no way you can expose it without the sources being traceable. And in those circumstances, we won't go public. But it's very frustrating.
Yes, ma'am.
Moving on to what might be a slightly more difficult ethical dilemma, what would happen if there was information that you were privy to that you could print that, in the interest of the First Amendment, might be legitimate, but you felt it might create a problem in terms of national security? How do you strike that balance?
I think that actually comes up quite frequently. I was having a discussion with some journalists the other day when the British hostages were being held by Iran. What would you do if you found out that the hostages were in fact spying? Would you print that information or not? And there were a bunch of TV journalists in the room, and there was some division of opinion. Generally, information is withheld for national security reasons. I think in that one, that was a theoretical debate. I don't know anything about whether those hostages were spying or not, but I think in that debate, people pretty much came down on the side that they would not print it on national security grounds.
Yeah, although this is so misused. Just to give you one example, I guess it was about a year ago, Dana Priest at the Washington Post wrote an article about secret detention facilities that the CIA was maintaining in Eastern Europe. And in her article, she said that the names of the countries involved were being withheld at the request of the CIA. I don't know that was the right decision. And in fact, that afternoon, Human Rights Watch named the names of the countries because we've been doing the work parallel. ABC put out a story for about half an hour they had on the website. They also named the names of the countries. And then the CIA got to them and they pulled it off the website. So we actually, got the website and we sort of saved that. So we sort of, it's out there if you want it. But the evidence was not that hard to piece together. We basically took flight logs, which are public documents, and worked with these so-called plane spotters, who are these people who have, nothing better to do on a Saturday afternoon than go hang out at the local airport and, write down the serial numbers, the registration numbers of the planes that land. And so we were able to sort of trace flights. And to give you one example, there was a flight that, started at Bagram Air Base, which is, the main U.S. air base in Afghanistan, where there's a detention center, flew to this remote civilian airport in northeastern Poland, where there's a military base nearby, flew to a military base in Romania, flew to Morocco, and then to Guantanamo. So it was clearly, a detention flight. This air base in Poland in particular is absolutely in the middle of nowhere. And when you talk to people on the ground, they would say that when the American planes would land, nobody was allowed there. The people would come on and off. They paid huge amounts of money in cash to just sort of deal with the whole thing. And so it became completely obvious what was going on. And we saw no reason not to name the names. That the only national security interest involved was, that somehow the CIA had convinced Poland and Romania that it was appropriate to help disappear detainees, which is what the CIA was doing at the time. And these are people who were unacknowledged, who had disappeared off the face of the earth, and who were being tortured through waterboarding and other techniques. And so, the Bush administration is maintaining this now. If you look at the transcripts at the military commissions in Guantanamo, the parts that are blanked out are the parts where the detainees describe their torture. And the Bush administration is maintaining this as a national security issue. I think that's an utter inappropriate use of this. And we felt that the right thing to do was to expose this. And by doing that, we've launched various investigations in Europe into, why was Poland doing this and why was Romania doing this. I think we've built up a strong political movement in Europe that they'll never do this again. And we've helped to stigmatize a process that is, as wrong as it gets in human rights terms. Disappearing and torturing people is, no one should be doing that. But the Washington Post was sort of cowed into not publishing this, even though they sort of went as far as they could because of national security. And indeed, what ended up happening is a bunch of papers would start saying, it has been reported that the CIA was using these secret detention facilities. Human Rights Watch says that they were Poland and Romania. And they kind of kept blaming us. rather than using, the sources that they had as well that would have told them the same thing. And so, real national security is one thing, but this, over-expansive national security is a totally different matter.
Can I just say one thing on that, which is that I think national security is used as an excuse in covering up incredibly petty things under the way that the government uses the Freedom of Information Act. That the government, I think, is basically in violation on a regular basis of the law in that case. That I filed a FOIA request for a book that I was writing, and first of all, they just take so long that the act might as well not exist, that I managed to actually get the documents shortly after the book came out. It was not that useful. And in the interim, I managed to get the documents so that I could then, when I got the official redacted version, I could compare them with the non-redacted version that I had and see the things which the government, first of all, the amount of stuff that's stamped as secret and shouldn't be secret is ludicrous. And secondly, the things that they redacted, which were supposed to be, that these were not covered under the Freedom of Information Act because they compromised national security, I could see what they were. This was about the Dayton peace talks. The U.S. State Department, in its wisdom, redacted a description of how one of the members of the Bosnian Serb delegation at Dayton, while meeting with an American delegate at Dayton, this guy was an alcoholic, Nikola Koljevic, who raided the minibar of the American diplomat he was meeting with. And this was something that was obviously embarrassing. I could see why this would be embarrassing to Republika Srpska, but not why this has anything to do with national security of the United States. And there it was blacked out. So we'll take one more, and then I think I'll ask Dean Slaughter to wrap it up for us. So yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the chance. Before I ask the question, I'd like to say that I'm a Sri Lankan Tamil. I left the country in 1977, and Princeton was one of my places where I got my education. Now I have family in the US, so that being the background, what I like to point out is that the humanitarian intervention is a fine goal, but as of today, if you look at the sufferings around the world, most of the problems occur in conflict zone, where you have a government and then you have a population that is not part of a major representative government. The problem I see in the long run is that there is no voice for the disenfranchised people around the world. And if you take, say, US media or government statements, they are generally very comfortable mouthpiecing what the local governments are willing to put out. So that means that there is always a significant amount of population's voices are not being brought out. And the problem is how we are going to allow that voice to be heard. Otherwise, what you're going to see is about 150 nations around the world. Out of that, let us say, the top 10 are not corrupted. The rest is fundamentally corrupted or puppets of some other governments. And here, this is the spot where we, as a Sri Lankan Tamil, I see a major defect or deficiency in the system. I'm sure that you're not going to be able to solve this problem today, but I just wanted I drove about 100 miles just to come here to say this, make this comment to you. All right, and if you have some thoughts, I like to hear, because there is a tremendous amount of frustration among people who are not part of the established governments.
Okay.
Well, I don't know what I can say. I agree with you. I think, as Peter noted very eloquently, often something gets reported as a humanitarian conflict or a humanitarian issue when it's really a political issue, and that might disguise what's really happening. Also, for us as reporters, we're not supposed to take sides politically. There's a great, stress on being objective, not getting too involved, and that, I think, from your point of view, would hurt the reporting. Hurt the quality of the reporting. And, sometimes it does for us, too, because reporting without a point of view is just facts. It doesn't make sense without, outrage and passion. But if you get too passionate and too outraged, you'll be, dismissed as a flake as a reporter, and your work won't be taken seriously. So, yes, there are a lot of deficiencies. I mean, we're just reporters. We're not activists.
Well, I think a lot of what foreign correspondents try to do is to kind of find the people who are not the ones with the voices and the megaphones, who are not the governments. I mean, I don't spend a lot of time when I'm in foreign countries in government offices. I don't think Barbara and a lot of my colleagues do. I mean, some do, but we really do try to get out there. I think the problem is going to be that there are fewer and fewer of us. You know, newspapers are cutting back, have cut back tremendously on the number of foreign bureaus and foreign correspondents they have. TV, I mean, you can forget about it except for, you know, CNN these days in terms of having foreign bureaus. And TV correspondents are so kind of laden with sound men and all that, they don't really get out as much and as far as they should. And so I think in the future, it's going to be less people like myself and Barbara who are going to be the loudspeaker or megaphone or the conduit for, let's say, the Tamil movement or whatever, but the Tamils themselves, or whatever the independence movement or a grief group it is, through new technology, through the internet, through blogs, through websites, who knows what. They're going to have to be their own voice because there are fewer and fewer of us out there.
Let me just do a quick thought on this, which is I would distinguish between what governments say and what certainly, you know, the human rights movement does. In other words, there is a tendency for governments to adopt the perspective of other friendly governments. And so in Sri Lanka's case, you know, certainly throughout Europe, within the United States, there's going to be an identification with Colombo. And I think that's probably part of what leads to your frustration. I actually think with the human rights movement, it's almost the opposite. I mean, we tend to report, you know, perhaps too much on governmental abuses. I mean, we aspire in any conflict situation to report on abuses by both sides. And we've done quite a bit on abuses by the Tamil Tigers as well. But I'm sure that if you sort of, you know, total up our reports, we've done more on Sri Lankan government abuses than LTTE abuses. But so I think, you know, and I don't know, sort of, I suspect journalists tilt more in that direction as well. So I think that the real issue is, you know, maybe the problem is more where governments tend to lie. But let me just conclude with Peter's point, because I do think it's a very important one. I don't think it's, you know, it will be a real loss if all we have is different groups, you know, having their own megaphone, because you lose the intermediary of somebody going in with, you know, somewhat of an objective perspective and analyzing what's going on. And you don't get that with just, you know, sort of superficial blogs or with everybody posting their own website. And it's a real problem because if this is a whole separate symposium, but if you look at the economics right now, the institutions that have to survive on publishing a newspaper itself are all cutting back, and TV is gone effectively. The economic models that are working are NPR, which is living through contributions, not through commercial revenue. You have something like Reuters, which is basically subsidizing its presence through its business sales. And there are a few models out there, the BBC, which is living off government subsidies, but commercial enterprises are suffering right now. And I'm not sure what the answer is, but it is a huge loss, and I'm not going to be satisfied by just kind of reading everybody's blog. It's not the same thing.
On that note, let me thank our panel and turn it over to Anne-Marie Slaughter to wrap up the whole day's colloquium, the whole 2 days colloquium.
Let me add my thanks to this panel, which is a wonderful way to conclude, and I have to add my thanks, as Gary began, to all of you. This is the hardcore. This is the largest audience I've ever seen for a final panel in 5 years of doing this, and on the prettiest day. So that is a testament to the power of the panel. Let me start with a bunch of thank yous, and please hold your applause. I want to make sure that the various people who've really made this possible get thanked. I get to be the face of the colloquium every year, but a lot of work goes into it over the course of the year. First, our co-sponsors, the Office of Religious Life with Paul Rauschenbusch, the Pace Center with Kiki Jameson, the Center for Human Values with Anthony Appia, the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics, headed by Larry Bartels, the Center for Health and Well-Being, headed by Chris Paxson, and the WWPN, the Woodrow Wilson Political Network, Ross Cohen and Brian Andrews, particularly, whose idea it was to bring you the panel that you saw this morning with Senator Frist, Jim Leach, and Governor Spitzer. We aim every year to make the colloquium a university-wide event, and these are all the parts of the university who sponsor the different panels. Then I want to thank our students, many of whom you've seen helping, either holding microphones or guiding people around or asking questions. Josh Walker, who's there, who's been the rapporteur and whose job it will be to help us turn this into a final report. Jessica Colon, Ariel Lutwick, Nick Ehrman, Kate Sheriff, Britt Lake, Jennifer Burnett, Ashley McCants, Bee Wong, Lori Freeman, Joey Bristol, and Mary Ahn. We're delighted they're all MPP or MPA students, and we're grateful to them. And finally, our fabulous staff, Pat Trinity, many of you who are standing outside, Terry Murphy, who actually does this off-site from Cape Cod every year. She started with me on the Harvard Colloquium for Public and International Affairs, which is now happily the Princeton Colloquium. We still use her expertise. Steve Barnes, our Assistant Dean for Public Affairs, Donald Yu, who's been sitting here, who not only helps us put the colloquium together every year, but is the head of the University Channel and PolicyNet, and this webcast will be able to be vodcast and podcast too. So any of you who liked any of the panels and want to tell your friends about it, it will be available on the University Channel, and people can download it and listen at their leisure. Anthony Rose, Betty Ann Bertrand, Tom Garrity, Franco Ciccone, and Marianne Goldfarb, and finally, and of course she's disappeared, Elizabeth Colajury, there she is, right there. Thank you, Liz. My invaluable special assistant whose job it was this year to pull all of this together. We should give all of them a round of applause, please. And finally, for those of you who are our alumni, we do this every year as part of our alumni weekend, and there we could not do this without Ann Corwin, Sunday Bridget Jones, and Amy Craven, who pull it all together from the alumni side. So there's good. Let me just end by telling you what I take away from two very rich days. I'll tell you briefly. We will be putting together a final report. But interestingly, we started out yesterday listening to Bob Putnam and then to our panel from listening to various evangelical leaders about the demands of God and hearing Paul Slovic then talk later in the afternoon. But the morning was all about more is more. I mean, Bob Putnam started by saying, look, what it really takes to get active citizen participation on issues of concern, whether it's the environment or human rights or globalization, is connections. He said religious citizens are better citizens not on religious issues, but on all issues, on secular issues. They contribute more, they participate more. And he said the reason is because they're the most connected. They're the people who have the richest friendship networks, and ultimately mobilization is about having someone ask you to do something and not being able to say no. I, of course, took notes as a fundraiser. But the point being, he said, look, those who are most religious are part of the densest social connections, and that makes them easiest to mobilize. That means they get more demands and they say yes. So it's really about more connections and more links in socially and politically. Then, as of Paul Slovic's talk and hearing today your panel, it was actually the opposite message. In many ways, what we were hearing was less is more. It's too easy to overwhelm people. You need to take it down from the statistics to the stories, to the one story. It's not even just putting a human face, it's making the one connection, the one story, the one picture, the one slogan that will somehow then allow people, in Bob Putnam's words, to wrap their minds around it. Or I guess it was Paul Slovic who said, so it's really bringing it way, way down to the one connection. And I take away from that, actually listening to this panel, and thinking about what are some of the things I'll start thinking about. I think it's really about making the political personal. Back to the feminist slogan of the personal is political. But it's really taking what are often very complicated political situations with lots of different incentives and complicated stories and bringing them to the point that you can make a human connection, that you can make a personal connection. It is easier to make a personal connection with one than it is 10, 100, and certainly hundreds of thousands. But it's not as simple as just taking it down to one story. It's got to be the right story. It's got to be a story that allows us to make a direct human connection and that says, from one human being to another, we can do something about it. Because your story about the Save Darfur versus the Genocide Olympics is exactly right. We have to believe, one person to one person, that we can make a difference. And if we hand people the tools, through journalism, through activism, through politics, that ultimately then I think is empowering for the individuals through the political process, and ultimately we hope to the individuals on the other side of the world or here in Princeton or in any of our localities. So from passion to politics, I hope all of you have taken some of the passion of this weekend, and I hope you find ways to translate it into your own personal politics, our national politics, and our global politics. Thank you.